These files are all that remain of the expedition team that went into the jungles of Ghana. It is unknown what happened to the researcher or their experiments. When we arrived, their lab had been razed to the ground, and there was no sign of them or the Pokemon they had discovered. However, if these files are to be believed, then they were doing a lot more than the research that they had claimed. We will move these files to the Pokemon Mansion on Cinnabar Island for now. Perhaps further study will shed light onto what Fuji's team had been doing.
July 6th, 19... We have discovered a previously unknown Pokemon deep within the jungle. We have, as of yet, to make contact with it, but we have high hopes that we will soon meet this creature. July 10th. We have managed to capture this Pokemon and are now running some tests on it in our lab. Due to its adorable cat-like appearance, we have decided to name the Pokemon Mew. February 6th. Our research has been an unparalleled success. Today, Mew gave birth. We have decided to name the infant Mewtwo. September 1st. It's no use. We can't control it. Mewtwo is far more powerful than we had ever anticipated. I fear for the safety of everyone if it were to escape. Try as we might, we have failed to curb its violent tendencies. We have to put an end to this experiment before it is too late.
Let's be completely honest here. Is there any Pokemon more fascinating than Mewtwo? Yeah, there are other legendaries who have a lot more lore behind them, but the clone of Mew is by far the one that has us the most interested. That is, if it even is a clone. Here, let me start from the beginning. Mewtwo's first appearance is, obviously, in Pokemon Red and Blue versions. As you progress through the game, you find subtle nods to an extraordinarily powerful Pokemon that you finally have a chance to battle only after you become the Kanto region's Pokemon champion. He is built up so perfectly that there is no wonder why we all love him so much. In fact, I would argue that Mewtwo's popularity is second only to that of Pikachu. But what is Mewtwo, really? The commonly accepted origin for Mewtwo is that he's a clone of Mew created by Team Rocket that got out of control. But that really only comes from the first movie, and none of that lore is present in the games. However, if you turn to the Pokédex, you get some decent information on Mewtwo's origin. In Red and Blue version, it says that it was created by a scientist after years of horrific gene splicing and DNA engineering experiments. Yellow version adds to that by saying that its DNA is almost the same as Mew's. However, the size and disposition are vastly different. In Generation 3's Ruby and Sapphire, it says that Mewtwo is a Pokemon that was created by genetic manipulation. However, even though scientific power of humans created this Pokemon's body, they failed to endow Mewtwo with a compassionate heart. And in Fire Red, it says, a Pokemon whose genetic code was repeatedly recombined for research. It turned vicious as a result. The Pokédex makes it very clear that Mewtwo isn't a clone. Cloning, by definition, makes a genetically identical creature by using the DNA of a host creature. There may be a few subtle differences, and maybe even different personalities between the original creature and the cloned creature, but in the grand scheme of things, they are going to be genetically identical. That is not the case with Mewtwo. Mewtwo is drastically different from Mew. I mean, put the two Pokemon side by side, and they look completely different. I mean, if anything, Mewtwo looks like the evolved version of Mew. However, interestingly enough, the process of how Mewtwo came into the world, as described in the games, is almost identical to the process of cloning. If you go to the Pokemon Mansion on Cinnabar Island and read through the journals that are scattered throughout the place, you learn that they didn't simply clone Mewtwo from an eyelash in a vat of chemicals as shown in the movie. Instead, Mew gave birth to Mewtwo. In reality, when actual scientists clone animals, they will take cells from an adult animal and an unfertilized egg cell from a female of the same species. They then remove the nucleus from the egg and insert the cells from the other animal using an electrical pulse to make the cells fuse with the egg cells. The fused cell will then divide and grow into an embryo, which is then implanted into another female of the same species, a surrogate, if you will, and allowed to develop until the female gives birth to an exact genetic copy of the animal that the original cells were taken from. It doesn't take much reading between the lines to realize that Mewtwo was created in a very similar way. Except for one thing. According to the Pokédex, Mewtwo's genetic code was repeatedly recombined for research, meaning that before they ever implanted the cells into the surrogate Mew, they tweaked the genetic code so that it would eventually give birth to Mewtwo. And frankly, it's astonishing that they ever managed to produce anything from these attempts, much less something that is still very genetically similar to Mew, simply by reshuffling Mew's DNA. DNA is extraordinarily delicate and has to be combined in exactly the right ways in order to produce anything living, and messing with that even slightly could cause horrific mutations or worse. This is one of the reasons that so many genetic experiments end in failure today, including cloning, which is extraordinarily straightforward compared to what the Pokédex seems to be suggesting created Mewtwo. However, there is a way in which Mewtwo's genetic code could have been reshuffled and still produce a Pokemon that was genetically similar to Mew, but still drastically different at the same time. Scientists experiment with this method regularly in today's world, and it has created some spectacular results in the field of medicine. The method in question is genetic hybridization, which is the process of combining two complementary single-stranded DNA or RNA molecules and allowing them to form a single double-strand molecule through the base pairing. In the simplest of terms, they take DNA from two different animals that are mostly similar, and they combine their DNA to create a new animal that is a combination of both. But what does all this have to do with Mewtwo? Well, what if I told you that Mewtwo is the first Pokemon created as a genetic hybrid between two other creatures? The evidence is all there. Mewtwo's drastically different appearance from Mew, his volatile personality, and the process through which he was created. But that still leaves yet another question. What is he a hybrid of? Well, if you go through the Pokédex, you'll never really find a Pokemon, especially in the original 150, that really looks like Mewtwo. At least enough for Mewtwo to be a hybrid of it and Mew. Furthermore, Mewtwo is a purely psychic-type Pokemon like Mew. You would think that if Mewtwo was a hybrid between two Pokemon of different types, it would also take the other Pokemon's type. So that means that whatever Mewtwo had to be a hybrid of, it would have had to have been something psychic. And that dramatically decreases our pool of choices, and nothing really fits the bill except for Abracadabra and Alakazam. And of those three, the most likely candidate seems to be Kadabra. The thing is, the researchers weren't there looking for Mew. If you go back to Cinnabar Island, you see that they were surprised to discover Mew, which means they weren't planning on doing these genetic experiments. So it would stand to reason that they wouldn't have brought any Pokemon to experiment on, and the only Pokemon they might have had with them are their personal Pokemon, which, if you've ever played the games, scientists usually don't carry psychic Pokemon around. And to further complicate the possibility that it was a Kadabra, the Japanese version says that there was only one researcher, and the Pokédex says that there was only one scientist that created Mewtwo. So it is unlikely that there was a Kadabra that tagged along for the expedition. However, the fact that Kadabra is our best option for what Mewtwo is a hybrid of does lend evidence to what Mewtwo actually could be a hybrid of. What if Mewtwo isn't a hybrid of Mew and a different Pokemon at all? What if instead Mewtwo is a hybrid of Mew and a human? If you go back to the Pokemon Mansion, there is one entry in the journals that is extremely relevant here. And it says that Mew gave birth. Pokemon don't give birth to live young. Only humans do. And it makes sense that Kadabra is the Pokemon that most resembles Mew, because Kadabra was also once a human. If you open up the Pokedex, it reads, "It happened one morning. A boy with extrasensory powers awoke in his bed, transformed into Kadabra." Mewtwo is not simply a clone of Mew. It is a Mew-human hybrid. And I promise I'm not blowing smoke here. I'm not the only one that has proposed this possibility. It may not be canon, but the Pokemon Adventures manga states that Blaine created Mewtwo and added human cells into the mix because they didn't have enough of Mew's cells. Granted, the manga isn't canon, but it does show the idea that Mewtwo was a Mew-human hybrid was at least considered. And that's not even where this ends. The Pokedex referenced these experiments as horrific, and what is more horrific than a creature that evolved to lay eggs being biologically altered in order to give live birth, probably multiple times given the likely failure rate of such an experiment? And why would Mew have been altered to give birth if not to bear an offspring that couldn't form in an egg outside its body? Mewtwo was the result of experiments done by researchers who saw the opportunity to do potentially illegal genetic experiments after discovering a previously unknown Pokemon. And the result was the most powerful, the most aggressive, and the most dangerous Pokemon ever to be brought into the world. But what do you guys think? Is Mewtwo a Pokemon-human hybrid, or am I just looking way too deeply into this? Or is there some piece of information that I missed? Leave your comments below, and I'll respond to as many as I feel like. Oh, and by the way, before I let the end card take it away, if you're interested in learning about any of the real-world topics I talked about, there will be links to some of the research that I used in making this video in the description, so feel free to go check them out.